Hi, welcome to the lecture on Chapter 2. This chapter is on basic switch and end device configuration. And basically, we say, I'm not going to teach you how to do all end device configuration, but mostly we're going to talk about how do you set up basically your PC, your laptop, changing IP addresses. Most of you never have to do that because you have DHCP set up on it, and that algorithm and system goes out and acquires IP addresses, default gateway setups, and things like that, DNS setups. This module we're going to talk about basically, as you can see off to the left-hand side, we're going to look at why you want to take this module, what are you going to learn. Look at iOS. Look at how Cisco's operating, because Cisco doesn't have a graphical user interface aspect. It is strictly command line. So talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about iOS navigation, how to get within the different layers of that operating system, what the format of the commands are, and then some basic device configuration, how to save those configuration, how to set data on different ports. If you look at your home router at home, you probably have 4 ports on it that you plug an Ethernet cable to. We'll talk about how to get to those ports and how to set addresses, how to configure IP addresses, and then how do I verify some of that connectivity. I've debated whether to give you one full lecture on all this stuff or break it up into smaller pieces, so you'll have to let me know maybe I'll break it up and try it. So let's look at why you should take this module. Well, the reason you want to take this module is basically, if you're going to get into networking, what do you deal with? You deal with equipment, and you deal with PCs and routers and stuff. So you need to say, once you take them out of the box, you got to do something with them. Nothing's installed, whether it's a computer that you bought from Best Buy or you bought a new switch from Cisco. They come back pretty much blank, out of the box, nothing set up. And more than likely, you're going to want to do some general configuration on them. So we're going to talk about some of that stuff. So some of the information you learn, I think, went through all of that stuff. So let's look at basic iOS. Now, an operating system is made up of several different components. You've got the user interface, that's us, that interfaces to a device, a computer, and that software controls a lot of things. So it's broken to 3 different layers from the time you log in. There's an outside shell, which it's the interface pretty much between you and your computer. It makes both commands, either GUI or command line interfaces. So it's kind of like the shell goes between you and the computer, and then the kernel goes between the hardware and the software. So if I click on the shell, I'll give you a little bit bigger picture of that, make it a little bit easier. So what you see here is the shell allows you to interface with it, and the kernel it's going to put its own language to control the physical hardware of the device. And of course, the hardware itself, it's the CPU, it's a disk drive, it's the memory, all of that stuff that goes into that. Now, when you're using command line interface, it'll look something like this. It'll be, if you've ever gone to the DOS prompt in your computer, this is what you see. You see pretty much a black background and a cursor. And with that, you can type in certain commands. In this case, gives you an example of one. We're all comfortable with GUI, which is graphical user interface. So you can, I won't go into that. You all use it. Everybody uses it. And they make changes to it and stuff. But a lot of cases, that stuff is done via the firmware. Now, what's the purpose of an operating system? Basically, the purpose of the operating system is to control the PC, either through the GUI or command line, if you're looking at a GUI, you got a mouse that you got to position it, you've got to enter text, and then it displays information to the monitor or to a printer or to an email or whatever the case may be. So it's controlling input, processing, and output. Well, the command line does a little bit the same, but it doesn't use a mouse. It ends up using the keyboard to actually take text commands. You type in the command, the processor then processes the request, and then it displays this on an output to a monitor. But you're going to learn here quickly that a switch or a router, that's Cisco, that you're learning to program doesn't display to a monitor per se. It just calculates the stuff, and you have to view that output once you connect a computer to you can connect what we call a console cable that connects your PC to the inner workings of the operating system to make that something you can see. Here's an example of how you can download particular software for in this case, a catalyst. It's a switch, a Cisco switch, 2960, 24 ports. Luckily, all the lab equipment, I don't even think there's a lab in Packet Tracer to have you install software, but it's really no different than you installing software on any other application, any other computer you've got at home. Now, there are definitely a few ways you can access a switch or a router. Now, basically, a switch, its main function is to forward traffic, period. It doesn't even have an on-off switch. You plug a switch in, it powers up, and 24 ports are ready to go. You plug in an Ethernet cable, and you're off and running. But there are some behaviors, some things you want to change for security purposes. So one of the things that you're going to learn in this class is how do I connect a console cable? So basically all a console cable is a cable that runs out of a RS-232 port of your computer. And if you're using a laptop, a lot of those don't have an RS-232 port anymore. So you'll have a USB that'll have an RS-232 port. You'll have a little bit of a dongle to connect to that. Now, if you were doing a lab in, let's say, one of the labs we got on campus, those computers, those desktops do have RS-232 cables, and you just plug in this console cable from that into the switch itself. Now, Cisco's pretty nice that it kind of lets you know what's a console cable, what's anything else. Well, a console cable basically says, hey, it's in baby blue color. It is, so when you see it on Packet Tracer, when you see it in the lab, if it's a baby blue cable, it's a console cable. And that allows me to interface between my PC and the kernel of the switch. Now, you can use secure shell to get access to it, and another command in telnet. Now, both of those are basically, you can get remote access. So secure shell and telnet are a way to get remote access to telnet or to a switch or to a router, because switch and routers, even though we're only talking switches, they use the same methodology as far as user interface, connectivity, types of security you want to put in place. So I got a console cable, plug that in, or I could go in through an outside Ethernet cable, and if you typed in or knew the IP address and the password, you could get into a system remotely. By default, and the telnet is a little insecure, only that it keeps everything in clear text. It's not encrypted. So most things we're going to learn is turn off telnet, use secure shell, change some of the standard defaults, the same thing you do in your home router. When you get a home router, what do you have to do? They want to say, change the login and password of the administration password. You're going to learn to do the same thing here. Now, because a switch and a router doesn't have a terminal, you need to run a terminal emulation program. And a terminal emulation program, and there are a couple, there's PuTTY, TerraTerm, and Secure CRT. In most of the labs, I mean, I like using PuTTY, but I think you'll probably see in Packet Tracer you're going to use TerraTerm. And when you click on TerraTerm, it's going to look similar to this. You're going to say, what am I connecting to? I'm connecting to a TCP. I'm connecting to basically an Ethernet port. You've got an IP address. Which port am I using? How am I getting access? And all of these are things that we'll talk about later. If I can't even click, I was going to say I couldn't even click the serial port, but it just gives you, that's what the user interface. Same thing with PuTTY. PuTTY gives you a little bit more data. That's why kind of like what I like to do. I can control more things. I can give it a host name and IP, which port. I just like this one better. But I think you'll find Packet Tracer in most of your exercises will be, oops, let me out of that, is going to be in TerraTerm. So just knowing that that's probably what you're going to see. Just to show you Secure RT. As you can tell, most of them tell you which protocol am I using. I'll put an IP address in, which port, and as you notice, port 22 is consistent across all of it. And then a few other things that you don't need to, whoops. So, this BiPAD lets you take the quiz. Let's look at how, now that I'm in, I took my console cable, plugged up the PC into my serial port, my RS-232 port into the console port, and your switch will have, it'll be labeled console, and it'll actually be baby blue. So that's where that's what you're looking for to see. Now, there are several different commands in this. There are primary command modes. The operating system, the iOS in Cisco, has multiple layers to it. And each layer gives you different access to different functions. And within that, the way they tell you is they change the command prompt. Now, as a security feature, you've got basically two command modes. You've got a user exec mode, which basically it gives you limited capabilities, but it's basically used just for viewing and monitoring data. And you can tell if you're in that mode if you see the greater than sign. As you can see down below, I'm in the user exec mode, and it's followed by just the greater than sign. The privilege exec mode allows you actually to make configuration changes to the system. So if being the network administrator that you are, you're going to have to log in to privilege exec mode to get higher permissions to make certain changes. And to know that you're in that mode, you will see the pound sign at the end. Now, there are other configuration now that you're in the privilege exec mode. That tells you one thing, but now I have to be in configuration mode. I have to get into a way to know that I'm actually making modifications. Now, one thing with this is once you execute a command, that command goes instantly because what? You are the administrator of the system. So whatever you type in, and once you hit enter, it will try to execute and input that in place. Now, there are a couple of examples, making sure you actually turn a port on. But once you turn that port on, it is active. It is live. Now, there's two different types of interface modes. There's a line configuration mode and an interface configuration mode. Now, the line configuration is used to configure the console, your SSH, your telnet, pretty much your port access into the switch or the router. And then the interface configuration mode is, I want to make changes to a particular interface. So once you type in, and the way to get that is I've got to type in configure terminal is the command to be able to get into the configuration mode. Once you do that, once you type in configure terminal, you get in parentheses gives you where are you. I am in the configuration mode. I'm still in my privilege mode. And then once I type in either the line or the configuration, the prompt will change. When you're in line configuration mode, you'll see config line. If it's interface configuration mode, you will see configuration IF. So pay attention to the prompts to make sure you're in the right mode, what layer. And if you hit question mark or type in help, the commands you're listed are only available at that particular level. You don't see every command across the whole switch. You just get the ones that are available based on what level you're on. That is called context-sensitive help. So based on where you are in the context of the operating system, those are the commands you're going to get. Now, I'm not going to go through, I'm going to let you go through primary mode commands, how to get to those commands, how to type them in. Watch that video. Well, watch this video, but I'm not going to show it to you, so you can pay attention to watch that video. Now, if I want to get between the modes, there are several commands you want to do. To get from user mode to privilege mode, you use the enable command. That command can get you into the privilege exec mode. To get out of it, you can type in disable, and that will move you back to user mode. So just keep that in mind. So to make configuration, so I got to be into the privilege exec mode. So I would type in enable. That would change my prompt. I'd see the pound sign. Then I would have to say I have to get into configuration mode, type in configuration terminal. Once I do that, once I type configuration terminal, the prompt will change to config, switch, config, pound sign. Then to get into the line configuration mode, or then it's here, I'm typing line, gets me in the line configuration mode. And now the question, which line am I dealing with? Am I dealing with the console cable? Am I using SSH? Am I using Telnet? You got to tell it what. So line, I'm going to the line terminal information, console, and then which port you're going to use. You can give a range of ports if you had more than one. But line, and then you notice the prompt would change. And then to get out of the line configuration in that subcategory, you type exit. And of course, if I type it exit one more time, you could then back up one more letter. Now, you can type in, to get out of the subconfiguration mode, you can type end, or you can do a Control-Z. You'll find that the more you play with this, you're going to learn fast keystrokes to get you past some of that stuff. Let's see, what else? Let's go on. I'm not going to watch that video. And this is just an example of the interface. And as you notice, you can go between line configuration to interface configuration just by typing right. So I can go between sub-configuration under config. So, and sometimes when you're setting up a switch the first time, being able to, I did the line, I put some passwords on, I put my security on. Now I just start interfacing a line. I'm going to start putting addresses on interface. Now I can just switch. Once I type in the interface, and then which port am I dealing with? I'm dealing with the fast Ethernet. And then we'll talk about that naming convention, pretty much bay and port for that interface. You can watch that video on how to get past all that stuff. I would run the syntax checker just for practice and navigating between it. It'll give you a lot of practice before you get into the homework. So I highly recommend you doing some of that. Bypass the quiz, and let's go on with how the commands are structured. Now, every command has a basic structure in Cisco. It basically says, there's a prompt I've started with, what the command is. There's always a space, so you can't string these along. There doesn't have to be a space between the prompt and the command. And I'm lazy, so I don't do that. But you got to put a space between these interfaces. So I got a space. Then now I talk about the keyword. What am I trying to do? In this case, I'm trying to show something about the Internet protocols command. Or in this example here, I am trying to ping or I'm trying to send a message to this IP address. So just that is the basic structure, and you will see it over and over and over and over again. Now, when you see text documentation, you'll see it boldface will be indicate the commands and keywords. Anything in italics, it is fields that you need to supply something. You need to put in a port number. You need to do something else. Square brackets means there's an optional element, and parentheses means there is a required element. And in some cases, if you'll see this vertical bar means, in this case, either Y or Z are going to be one of the two choices. So let you go through some of the examples. On a ping command, you got a ping, IP address, and that's your example. So basically, boldface gives you the command. The italics tells you you've got to enter something. And then once you enter the command, you have to hit carriage return. It won't do anything without it. So now talked about a little bit about help. I said it's context sensitive. So based on which command prompt, so is all the commands underneath that. And basically all you got to hit is question mark. You want to know which commands they are? Go to the command line prompt, hit a question mark. It'll tell you all the prompts that are available at that context of the switch. You can actually also hit the question mark on a particular character. So if you're starting to type a command, you don't remember what my options are, hit a question mark. If you don't know how to spell the rest of the word, hit a question mark. If you're partway through typing a command, you can hit the tab key and it'll fill out what it knows. If for some reason it doesn't know the command, you'll get an error message and there'll be a little bit of I'll call it a hat, but a caret that points to the character where that's the character it can't match up to any commands it's got. So keep that. So watch the video on how to do them. Here are some basic hotkeys that they may test you on it. I don't know, but you'll get used to getting tired of typing this and want to manipulate it around command line interface better. That you'll pick up on some of these pretty quick. Enter keys gives you the next line. Spacebar gives you the next screen. So now the ones that exit or end an operation, Control-C ends the configuration mode and returns to privileged exec. Control-Z, when in any configuration modes, ends configuration mode and returns to privileged exec. So there is a difference between Control-C and Control-Z. Now Control-Shift-6 is an all-purpose break. If somehow you're hung up in a DNS lookup, because like I said, the switch is going to try to execute it. Once you hit return, the switch is going to try to execute that. And it'll keep looking and looking and looking and looking until it finds it. In that case, you're going to learn this Control-Shift-6, because then it says, hey, stop looking. Don't look for an address. Don't look for a bad command, whatever. Just, you're going to learn to do that. Otherwise, you sit and wait 60 seconds before you get the prompt back when it times out. Give you a rough idea. Watch the video. Off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly which packet tracers I haven't. So you do not have, just go to the packet tracers I'm assigning you in Moodle. And if you want to do all of these that you see on the website, go ahead. But I know your time's valuable, and I'd only do the ones I assign you. So let's look at basic device configuration. First thing you want to do is I need to name a device. When it comes up, it could be, the default is switch. Well, if I look at campus, we probably have 50 to 60 switches. So I'm sure the network administrator would be if they had a problem with switch, they would not know which of the 50 or 60 to go to. So you try to be very specific and give it a name that's more descriptive so they know exactly which switch they're talking about. Now, the naming convention, that's got to start with a letter, contain no spaces. It's got to end in a letter or digit. I would basically only use letters. You can use letters, digits and dashes, but there is a limitation on how much you want to type in. And it's got a 64 character length. Usually you'll find an abbreviation that works. So the diagram says, switch dash floor 3. So that's switch for third floor. That's a switch for set third floor, first floor. You just want to make sure that when I'm looking at a report, when I'm looking at a status, I can tell which switch I'm looking for. So you want to make sure you specify a name for your devices. Now to do that, use the host name configuration. So I got to configure terminal to get in configuration mode. And then you type in host name, space, and then the name that you want it to be. And then all of a sudden you notice it switches the name. So it goes from switch to the name of the device. So that way you know I'm in configuration mode, privilege exec mode, and I'm working on the device you want to work on. Now, as with anything else, we want to make sure you set passwords. We want to make sure passwords are not easy to guess. Now, most of the labs in this case, you're going to see lowercase Cisco or class, and the directions will tell you how to do that. But you want to make sure that when you're choosing a password, use strong passwords, not easily guessed. Make sure they're more than 8 characters, a combination of uppercase, lowercase, special name, numbers. Same thing you've been used to on every other device that you've done. The question is, how do I change my passwords? Well, again, you're going to say, I'm going to configure the terminal. I got to get in configuration mode. So I typed in enable to get into privilege mode. I type in config terminal, or you can do CONF space T. If you're like me that don't type well, it makes it easier to go ahead and do that. Now, what am I trying to configure? I'm trying to configure the line, because I'm going to talk about the line coming in, the access to the switch, and I'm going to put a password on the console. And usually there's only one console, and we always start numbering with 0. So it's the line I'm going to change the input into the system. I'm going to change the console port, line 0. So all of a sudden my prompt tapes, now I'm in a sub-configuration mode. I'm in the line sub-configuration mode. I'm going to type in the password. So it tells me I want to change the password, and that password will be Cisco. Okay, so now I've set a password called Cisco, but I haven't set what I want that password to be on. Now the next line says, I want this password to be on the login. So when somebody logs into the switch, they've got to enter the password Cisco. So when you're setting up this console port, you're doing configure terminal, line terminal 0, identify a password, identify where the password is being applied, in this case the login, and then I end to get out of the line configuration mode. And then now when you do this, this password Cisco it's in text. So when you could look at all the settings on the switch, and you could actually read the password. Well, guess what? That's not very secure. So if somebody got in, they could see all your data. So what we like to do is we like to encrypt that data. And you can do that by using enable secret and then the password. That way, I'm saying I'm going configuration mode. I am going to enable, so I'm going to put a password on my enable command. So that not that everyone can get to that executive configuration mode, right? So I'm going to configure in, I want to say, I want to make sure I'm going to put a password on that enable command, and I'm going to encrypt it by using the secret. So I'm enabling it. I'm going to I'm going to encrypt it and give it a password, then hit exit. Now, when you get, every switch comes with what they call virtual terminals. It's an old term, but it is one to talk about other ports and other ways into the switch. And to set a password on those, you can set a range of steps. So in this case, I'm going to configure terminal. I'm getting the line configuration mode, but I also want access. And you remember when we did the console, it was console 0. Well, I've got the line, but I want it to be on the virtual terminals, the VTY, and there's 16 of them. They were numbered from 0 to 15. So if I tell you to put a password on your virtual terminals, you're going to type configure terminal, line VTY 0 to 15, along with password, what it is, Cisco, and when do I want to apply it? I want to apply it on the login, and I end my configuration setup. Now, once you've done that, and you say, can I just enable, can I encrypt all my passwords? Yes, you can. Well, and the command that does that is service password -encryption. So configure terminal, type in that one command, and all of the passwords that you type in, the enable password, the console password, all the VTY passwords that were currently in plain text will now be encrypted. Now, how do I know that? Well, if you run what we call, when you create commands, there's two places. There's a running configuration that says all my changes in this active session are stored in random access memory. And if I want to see what I've done and what changes you are, if you do show running -config, or for short, show run, it will show you the running configuration of everything that's going on. So it gives you all the commands, it tells you, in this case, it's giving you an example. Here's my console port, and you can tell it's encrypted. So here's your VTY, and VTYs, I think over time, it started out being 5 VT virtual terminals, then it went up to 16, but so instead of changing the range of the first part, they just added to it. So you're going to get that in two places. But you still can change the full range from 0 to 15 if that's what you want. Now, another thing you're going to always want to set up is a banner message. Now, what happens when you log in and your computer turns on and says, hey, welcome, blah, blah, blah. You may have unauthorized access if you don't belong here, so on and so forth. To do that, got to get in configuration mode, configure terminal. Once you do that, banner, message of the day. That's when you first log onto the system. Message of the day. Start with a pound sign. That pound sign says, hey, this is my special character. This is my delimiting character. Now, that character can be anything. But I would make it something that you normally don't type in the middle of a message. So that's why usually you see a pound time. Yeah, I like but it's pound sign, the message you want to slave, and then finish this. Because if you don't, everything you type on after that, they consider to still be in the message of the day. So take a look at the video for a little bit more details. I highly recommend you running through the syntax checker, making sure that works. We're going to skip past this. Now you've done all these modifications and changes. The question is, I want to save all the work. I don't want to lose it. So the way to do this is you want to do a save command. There are basically two file systems that the system keeps up. There's a startup configuration, which is what happens when it's a configuration of the switch that's stored in non-volatile RAM. So basically stuff that doesn't change when power gets off, when it's turned off. So that's startup configuration. So you first boot up the system, it runs through a bunch of steps, and it goes out of that startup configuration and loads that initial configuration. Then while you're making changes, all that stuff is stored in random access memory. And if you don't save it, it'll never get to the startup configuration. So it'll never get saved. It'll always be in a random configuration. If you power down, all the work you've done is lost. We showed you the show running configuration, and it basically gives you last time it changed, some general information. But you can also do show startup configuration, which would say, hey, what is going to happen when this thing boots up? So after I run if you may alter the running configuration and you want to, you haven't saved it, but you want to restore the previous settings, you've done a little work, you're going, yeah, I'm not sure I want to test this. You can do the reload command. And basically all it does is go back out to the startup configuration and reloads, restarts that problem. Now it'll prompt you whether you want to save the changes or not. So make sure you answer the question the way you want. If you were to, you save things to the startup configuration, but you really didn't want to, you want to get rid of that startup configuration and start from scratch, you can use the erase startup configuration or erase start command, and that will get rid of it. Here's another video. Now the question is, what happens if I'm making a lot of changes, but I'm really not ready to save it, so I want to capture some stuff. That's one thing good about terminal emulators. You can actually capture data that is being displayed, save it to a text file, and then you can reload that whole text file so you're not having to redo all the work you've just done. So the first thing, in this case, they're giving you a PuTTY, and you can do the same thing with TerraTerm. But basically, you're going to say, I want all session output, and you're going to tell you where you want to set it. And you can decide what you want to do with header files, and you want to put password fields on it. But every time now you do, let's say, a show run, then once you've set capture my session, so you'd go into the PuTTY configuration, the logging session, and it says, how do I want to log this session? And when you first brought up PuTTY, it's not logging anything. But if you wanted to save your configurations for a future day before you saved them or before you used them, you log all the session outputs, you put a file. I usually say ask me every time, but I also want to make sure I include a header note it is and flush the log file frequently so there's not a lot of data stuck about. And then when I run, once I've done that in PuTTY, every command you type will then be captured. So I don't do a lot of extra classes. I make sure I'm already logged in, everything's set. So all I want to do is do a show running configuration, and that whole capture is now sent to the file you called, in this case, my switch logs. And then you go back into PuTTY and turn off logging, so any of the commands you type in aren't being asked for. So then once we get to that point, then you can actually load that text file into, and we'll get into that. I think one of the labs we get into will show you how to now take that text file and actually input it in, so it actually looks at that data, because really when you look at that show run, those are all the executable commands, the commands that were executed to get in that file. So when you get into configuration mode and import that text file, all those commands are executed. I'm definitely pretty sure I assigned you configure session, but look at the assignments, packet tracer stuff in Moodle, and I think that'll be more than enough. Now the question is what about IP addresses? Well, I need to address everything. I need to see if I got some. I think shorter videos may be better for me. Let me know in the reflection journal what you think. Now I need to be able to communicate with an outside device. There has to be addresses on both the sending and receiving device. Same way if you're sending a letter from your house to your grandmother. You've got her address and your return address. So you got addresses, physical addresses of where you want to go. The same thing happens on on devices you want to communicate with in a wireless world or in a wired world. So whether it's computers, printers, voice over IP phones, security cameras, any device has an address. Now there are two different types of IP addresses. We're going to start with IPv4 version 4, but the whole world is migrating to an IP version 6. And we'll talk a lot about those two differences and why we're doing it and stuff at a later time. But an IPv4 address is made up of 4 dotted decimal notation devices that range between, I think they're 8 bits long, and each of that gives you a range between 0 and 255. And so that IP address is somewhere in that range between 0 and 255. But of course, not all of those are valid addresses, and we'll get more into that later. But you're going to put in a dotted decimal number into your IP address. Now, when you're setting an IP address on a PC, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but it'll look similar to this. I'm using the following address, and you type in the dotted decimal. Let me bring that up a little easier so you can see. Here's my 192.168.1.10. So there's 4 numbers between the range of 0 and 255. Not all of those numbers are used, and all of them have different meanings, and we'll get into that later. IPv4 has what it says. It has a subnet mask. It basically tells me, I see this address, but I want to know how much of this defines the network that it's on, and how much of it defines the physical device that I'm trying to communicate with. And that's what this subnet does. If it's a 1 in this address, if you took 255 and typed it into a binary octal or a decimal to binary converter, 255 would be 8 ones. So that means all 8 bits in this IP address are network bits. Same with this, and the same with this. When I see a 0, that tells me it's a host. So that means anything in this last octet, this last 255 addresses, is a host device. So we'll get a lot of that more when we get into that. Whoops, I wanted to. And then in this case, you'd also, whether I'm getting the DNS, you put another address for a DNS server. Most of our labs and stuff will probably do a combination, use DNS local, get it locally, get on the system, and I'll manually sign everything else. Now, IPv6 addresses are a whole lot different. They're 128 bits long. And instead of being in decimal format, they are in hexadecimal. So anything between 0 and, if you never looked at hex, there'd be letters between A to F in there. And then they're separated by, instead of by a dot, they're separated by a colon. So letting you know that. So they're larger addresses, they're in hex, so it gives you a whole lot more addresses to deal with. The subnet mask that we had up in IPv4, you had to specify how many ones there were. Well, that's what the subnet prefix is telling you. There are 64 network addresses. So out of this large number, 64 of these bits are network addresses. And then everything else is host. And then the default gateway, this is just an abbreviation for a standard default gateway, and we'll get into that a lot later. So now you have different interfaces and ports based on the different types, different medias that you're using. You can have copper, you can have fiber. Switches and routers come with multiple different interfaces and also different ports, whether it's 24, 48. Some of them are larger than that. Some are wireless. So you get different ways of, but all of them are addressable through the switch, doing the IP, config. You can configuration IP address for a particular interface. Basically, a media is just a way of carrying a signal, and it just depends on the media as to what you're going to send and how that data is going to send. And we'll talk a whole lot about media later. Ports and addresses, configure IP addressing. So on your PC, on your end device, basically you're going to what? I'm going to go to the control panel, network sharing center, change adapter settings. Once you can do that, you're going to right click and select properties, and you're going to display the local area network properties. And you're going to get some screen like this. Just give you a rough idea. It's going to get you something like that. And then you're going to select IPv4. As you can see down here is IPv6, but we're going to make modifications to IPv4. And then that's where you're going to see the screen where I can specify the IP address. And as you can see, I did an IP address, the subnet mask, tell me which of this addresses, network, which of its host, and based on if it's a 1 or 0 in the subnet mask, and a default gateway. Like I said before, we're going to use it, follow DNS, and we're not going to set one up. DNS servers, are definitely used to translate. And basically on DNS, it converts. Are you very good at remembering numbers? I know I'm not, but we're very good at remembering names. And DNS is a way of converting a name in from, correlates an address, a number address to a name. So it just kind of keeps track of all that. Now, sometimes you can set up the addresses automatically instead of having it specified. And that's done with DHCP. And we'll go into that a little bit later. And so the default, but it basically means I'm going to apply the, IP address information automatically and get the DNS information automatically. So you end up putting all this information into the DHCP setup, and then you tell the PC, hey, you go out to run that program, give me all the addresses and then we'll use whatever. And each time you log in, you may get different information. Let you play with the syntax, Chen. Now, the switch virtual interface. Now, when I wanted to a switch, being basically a dumb switch, once you power it up, all those ports come online, not very secure. There are ways to create small networks in setting up a range. And also, when you want to interface from the outside world, you want to you want to specify an interface into this device. So you want to make sure you specify an address that's accessible, and you set up that VLAN, and that's a virtual LAN. So I'm creating a kind of a fake LAN, a fake network, and giving it an address. So I'm in configuration mode. I'm going to do interface VLAN, and VLAN is still an interface. And I'm saying which VLAN is it? And you can define, there are certain ranges of VLANs you can use, and we'll go into all that later. In this case, I'm doing VLAN 1, IP address, give it a subnet mask. In IPv4, you have to specify both the IP address and the subnet mask. The system needs to know what's network and what's host. This no shutdown turns the port on. It's kind of a weird way, but no shut as abbreviation will turn a port on. And then if I want to make sure I'm setting a default gateway so that people can access the switch, the switch is still an accessible device from the outside world, so it needs an IP address and it needs a default gateway to make sure that it can communicate. And what's a default gateway? Default gateway is just an address of the interface that gets me to the internet or points me in that direction. I'll let you go through this. I'll implement connectivity. I don't remember if I gave you that one or not. Now the question is verify. Let's bypass that and then, whoops. Yeah. Basically, to verify activity, you can do a couple of commands. To see if you set everything up, you want to make sure you set IP address up on your interface. The big command you want to make sure you understand is show IP interface brief. That shows you on your switch or router what are your interfaces, what the address is, and if it is up or down, if you remember to turn, executed the no shut command. If you're setting it up on your PC, you can type in IP config to show you the status, to verify what information you have. So I would go ahead and practice, show IP interface brief and IP config. Look at the video. And that is, I'm not going to go through the practice quiz and stuff. So that should give you more than enough stuff. And let me know if you like one video or you'd rather have it broken down into smaller segments. So let me know. Appreciate it. Have a good time. Bye-bye.